On the edge of a scorched plateau in New Mexico, a solitary woman shared her last apple with a starving wild horse, just trying to offer a little kindness. She never imagined that by morning it would return, standing at her porch, tapping the door with its hoof, leaving behind something that would stun archaeologists, biologists, and reporters alike. What followed was a journey not spoken in words, but built on trust between the human heart and the untamed. Early summer wind swept across the red rock slopes of Durant Bluff, carrying the pungent scent of dry earth and late-blooming sage. Sunlight angled through the edge of the ridge, washing the plateau in pale amber and scorched gold. Joanna Weller stood bent over a half-finished stone carving beneath the porch of her wooden cabin, her weathered hands dusted in sandstone, her face calm, like she'd been carved from this land herself. At 46, Joanna wasn't just living on this land, she belonged to it. 12 years ago, after losing her husband in a rockfall while surveying a cave system to the west, she had withdrawn from the world. Not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to hold her back. The cabin, tucked at the very end of the Mesa Range, had become her silent stronghold, a place where the rocks seemed to whisper and the wind was her only companion. Beside her sat a basket of freshly picked red apples from the gnarled old tree behind the cabin. She was about to chisel the final detail into the wingspan of a soaring eagle statue when something wordless, made her spine stiffen. No sound, no voice, just a feeling brushing the edge of instinct. Joanna slowly lifted her head. There, at the edge of the slope not 20 yards away, stood a figure, still as stone. A horse. A wild Mustang, gaunt and dust-caked, its coat streaked black and white like smoke against granite. It didn't move. Its deep brown eyes locked onto hers, not in fear, not in threat, but in a quiet kind of witnessing. She set her carving tool down on the stone bench, wiped her hands on the canvas apron, and walked slowly toward the low wooden fence that separated her garden from the open plain. Her heartbeat slowed, as if every step required weighing instinct against law. She knew the Bureau of Land Management's rules well. Absolutely no feeding or contact with wild horses. But looking at the animal's sunken flanks, its dust-matted hide, and the silence in those eyes, Joanna felt something deeper than regulations. She saw a life asking, without sound, without plea. Without a word, she turned back toward the porch, picked the ripest apple from the basket, and returned to the fence. Without meeting the horse's eyes directly, she placed the apple gently atop the fence post and stepped back. "Just this once," she murmured. "I think you need it more than I do." The Mustang didn't rush. It lowered its head, ears tilted forward, eyes never leaving her. Then, with a ceremony-like slowness, it stepped toward the fence. Each hoofbeat was a blend of caution and dignity. When it reached the post, it paused, sniffed lightly, and delicately bit into the red fruit, chewing slowly, as if afraid to break something sacred. Joanna stood still, unblinking. In that fleeting moment, the world held its breath. There was only the sound of chewing, wind whistling past stone, and her own heartbeat. The horse finished eating, but didn't leave right away. It remained still, facing her. Those eyes, they weren't wild. They weren't tame. They looked like eyes that once knew trust, had lost it, and were now trying again. "What's your name?" she asked softly, as if speaking to the wind. No answer, of course. But when the horse turned, tapped its hoof once, and walked away down the slope, Joanna no longer felt like the one offering. She felt like the one who had just received a promise. Evening fell quickly across the highlands. Dark clouds gathered to the west, the scent of the season's first rain rising in the wind. Joanna went inside, lit the stove, and poured herself a cup of mint tea. Rain began to fall, first as a mist, then in heavy sheets. She sat by the window, eyes drifting across the glass streaked with water, but her mind had already wandered toward the hill where the Mustang had disappeared. That night, thunder rolled across the sky. She couldn't sleep. Her heart, so long silent, now beat like hoofbeats in a dream. Out there, somewhere among the wet red soil and stone, a wild creature had accepted a gift born of compassion. And somehow, it felt like the universe had heard it. Something had shifted. Joanna jolted awake to an unfamiliar sound cutting through the early morning rain. At first, she thought it was just a pine branch scraping against the roof, a common noise during the first summer storms. But the sound came again, steady, rhythmic. like someone knocking. Wind howled through the window seams, bringing with it the damp chill of dawn. Joanna wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders and stepped onto the cold wooden floor, her bare feet finding the familiar creak of worn floorboards. She glanced at the wall clock. 5:42 a.m. There wasn't a soul within miles. Her nearest neighbors, the Dennings, had moved away last year. Everyone else was at least a half-hour drive down winding, washed-out roads. The knock came again. Not urgent, not frantic, but intentional. Joanna froze near the front door. Out of instinct, she leaned to peer through the small pane of glass beside the hinge. Her eyes widened. Her breath caught. Standing on her porch, in the thick gray light of dawn and the drumming rain, was the same Mustang from the day before. And it was knocking. Its right front hoof gently tapped the wood, 3 short knocks. Then it stepped back slightly, waiting in stillness. Its black and white coat was soaked, hanging like a rain-drenched shroud. Water streamed from its long mane, the droplets collecting at the corners of its dark eyes, giving it the look of a creature that had been weeping. Joanna couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her hand slackened, and the ceramic mug she'd been holding slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. She stood frozen, heart pounding, each breath jagged, as if someone had just called her name in an ancient tongue only her bones remembered. But it wasn't just the horse that made her tremble. Lying beside its hoof was an object. A dark, weathered leather pouch, drenched in rain, edges frayed, stitching long worn by time. The leather looked handmade, as if from another era. Mud clung to its sides, and on the flap, barely visible through grime, were 3 embossed letters. JPH. Joanna's hand found the doorknob and paused. Every instinct warned her this wasn't part of the ordinary world, but the steadiness in the Mustang's eyes held her like an anchor. It didn't push forward. It didn't demand. It simply waited for her choice. Slowly, she opened the door, remaining just inside the threshold as if standing between reason and something older than reason. The horse took a respectful step back, deliberate, almost courteous. Then came a low sound, a soft nicker like the morning greeting of a long-lost friend. Joanna knelt beside the pouch. A musky, earthy scent rose from the damp leather, blended with rain and something ancient. She carefully unlatched the brass clasp. Inside, thick oilcloth was tightly rolled, as if someone had once tried desperately to protect the contents from water, from the world. She unwrapped it. Her hands went still. Inside was a leather-bound field notebook, inked with the words, Field Notes, J.P. Holloway, 1894. A hand-drawn map, wrinkled and yellowed, depicting what looked unmistakably like the western ridge of Durant Bluff. 3 faded black and white photographs of a bearded man standing near a jagged rock formation, and a small wooden box containing several raw gold nuggets, still caked with dirt. Joanna felt her breath catch. The name J.P. Holloway was no stranger to locals. He was a legendary explorer, part geologist, part prospector, famed in the late 1800s for daring expeditions across the American Southwest. Rumors claimed he discovered the last great vein of gold near Mesa Verde, then vanished without a trace. The Mustang gave another nicker, softer this time, almost like an urging. Joanna looked up and locked eyes with the creature. There was something in that gaze, something beyond survival. No longer a cry for help, no longer a plea. It was a request, an offering, a whisper from a wordless world. Joanna followed the horse's gaze toward the northwest to the sediment cliffs locals called Whispering Ridge. That same ridge was marked on Holloway's map, bold and unmistakable, with a deep red X. "You want me to go there?" she asked, half wry, half reverent. The Mustang nodded once. No, not nodded. Tossed its head. Then took a few steps away and waited. Joanna rose to her feet, the leather pouch still in her hands. Her blood felt like it was flowing backward through time. The rain hadn't stopped, but it no longer mattered. It was no longer a barrier. It was the backdrop of a journey, a truth, a promise never spoken aloud. She stepped back inside, set the pouch on the kitchen table, and gently laid out the map and field notes to dry. On the first page of the notebook was a handwritten line. "If I don't return, let the horses tell the rest." Joanna stood still for a long time. A wild horse had come to her door, brought the past with it, placed a mystery at her feet, and invited her to follow. And strangest of all, she wasn't afraid. The morning after the first summer storm, the air across Durant Bluff was startlingly clear. Sunlight filtered through a veil of lingering mist along the ridge, casting a silvery shimmer on rain-beaded pine needles, each droplet catching the light like glass. Joanna Weller stood under the porch eave, a backpack slung over one shoulder. In her hands were the old map and J.P. Holloway's leather journal, now safely wrapped in plastic. Her worn leather boots were laced tight, a faded stone-gray shirt tucked beneath a thick canvas jacket. She didn't fully understand what she was doing, but every fiber in her body urged her to go. Echo, the name she'd given the Mustang, waited by the narrow dirt path, head lowered slightly, as if it had been waiting forever. Its gaze was quiet, like the forest, but carried a certainty that made Joanna feel oddly at peace. "All right," she whispered, gripping her backpack strap. "I'm coming." Echo turned and began walking slowly. Its hoofprints pressed deep and sure into the damp earth, leaving a trail as clear as any map. All Joanna had to do was follow. They left her property's edge behind, weaving through dense sagebrush and onto a path likely known only to coyotes. Joanna took note of every landmark: a rock streaked with moss, a lightning-struck stump, claw marks from a bull elk along a birch tree. An hour passed. Then, Echo suddenly stopped near a narrow, rocky crevice. Its ears twitched. Joanna felt it too. Something was off. A high-pitched bark rang out, sharp, panicked, somewhere beyond a cluster of low brush. Joanna rushed forward, pushing aside branches. A boy, maybe 14, with dark skin and long black hair tied back with a leather cord, crouched among the weeds. Beside him, a black curly-haired dog was caught in old rusted barbed wire, trembling and whimpering. "Careful, don't pull too hard," Joanna called out. The boy looked up, startled, but not afraid. "I'm trying." He chased a squirrel and got tangled. Joanna knelt beside them and gently untangled the wire from the dog's leg. It whimpered but didn't bite. Once freed, it limped toward the boy, tail low. "Thank you," the boy said hoarsely. "My name's Micah Begay. My grandfather's the blacksmith up in the Navajo village to the north. I was looking for Shadow, this dog." Joanna studied him. "You're out here alone? It's not safe in these parts." Micah shrugged. "I know the trails, but this time, I guess I went too far." Echo approached, nose reaching toward Shadow. The dog backed away, wary, but didn't bark. Joanna noticed how Echo paused, studying Micah intently. Then the Mustang turned and glanced back at both of them, then resumed walking. Joanna raised an eyebrow. "Looks like it wants us to follow." Micah blinked. "Wild horses don't do that. This one might not be like the others," Joanna replied, completely serious. They continued together. Micah walked beside Joanna, with Shadow hobbling just behind. As they moved deeper into the hills, the forest seemed to change. Trees grew thicker, light dimmer, and odd sounds filled the air. Whispers of wind through stone, water dripping from hidden ledges. The land felt ancient. Near midday, Echo led them through a narrow stone pass hidden between two massive boulders. Joanna nearly gasped as they emerged into a hidden valley, a place untouched, unmarked on any modern map. Lush grass carpeted the ground. Wildflowers bloomed between mossy rocks. In the center sat a small crystal-clear lake, so still they could see the stones at its bottom. A herd of wild mustangs, more than 10, grazed nearby. They didn't flee at the sight of people. They simply watched. Calm. Untroubled. "Oh my God," Joanna whispered. "They're here, healthy, relaxed, like they've lived with people before." Micah stood frozen. "I've never seen a place like this." Echo stepped into the herd, bowing its head toward a white mare with a gray streak on her forehead. They touched noses, a greeting, then turned to look back at Joanna and Micah. Joanna pulled out a camera and took a few photos. But what truly held her attention was the northern rock wall. Faint carvings etched into the stone, shapes of horses and humans, spirals, handprints, ancient petroglyphs. She stepped closer. The carvings were unmistakably prehistoric, similar to those she had studied during earlier archaeological expeditions. But here, tucked in a valley no one knew existed, they took on deeper meaning. "These symbols, they're telling a story," she murmured. Micah stood beside her, eyes wide. "I've seen some like that in caves near our village. Grandpa says they're the unspoken language, when horses and people used to speak the same tongue." Joanna shivered. She looked toward Echo. The horse stood beneath a canopy of trees, sunlight streaming through the leaves like a halo. A wild Mustang had led the way. A native boy had appeared mid-journey. A hidden valley untouched by maps, and stone carvings that whispered of a time when humans lived alongside horses, not just taming them, but trusting them. And all of it had begun with a single apple. Dusk draped over the hidden valley like a blanket woven from sunset and shadow. Joanna sat by the edge of the small lake, once a subsurface spring, now exposed by seasons of flooding. Echo stood not far from her, still as a sentry. Micah rummaged through the dry twigs he'd gathered, while Shadow, his black dog, lay curled under a pine tree, eyes tired but watchful. Joanna opened J.P. Holloway's weathered journal and carefully flipped to the beginning. The fading light slanted over her shoulder, just bright enough to make out the browned ink etched in a confident hand. June 4th, 1894. I followed this herd for 3 weeks. They led me to a valley missing from every map. In the northern cliff wall, there is a fracture. I believe it leads to the gold vein. But what surprises me more is the way these horses look at me. Joanna looked toward the north cliff, where the Mustangs had now gathered. They didn't move. They stood together as if communing, speaking a language not made for ears. Echo stepped away from the group and walked toward her, nodding his head gently to the left side of the valley. Not a command, not a demand, a gesture, a quiet invitation. Joanna stood. Micah came over, sensing the shift. "He wants us to follow," the boy whispered, reverently. They followed Echo through tall grass toward a broad, moss-covered boulder roughly the size of a living room floor. Its surface was uneven, streaked with age and rainwear. But as Joanna knelt beside it, something caught her eye. An irregularity in the moss, like someone had once tried to hide or erase. "Give me a hand," she said. Micah dropped to his knees beside her, and together they gently scraped away moss and soil. After 10 minutes of careful work, a narrow crescent-shaped crack emerged. Beneath it, a horizontal timber beam, aged, half-buried, clearly placed with purpose. Beyond that, darkness. A breath of cold, damp air seeped out, carrying the scent of wet rock and buried time. Joanna stepped back, her pulse quickening. This is an old mine entrance. She pulled a flashlight from her pack and carefully shined it inside. The space was cramped and low, but the pickaxe marks on the stone were clear. Old timber braces lined the entry. They didn't go in. It would have been too risky without gear. Instead, Joanna laid out the old map on a flat slab. It matched. Holloway had written, "From the lake, turn left past 3 stone ridges. The buried entrance lies beyond." Every detail aligned. But one note caught her breath. In the map's lower margin, circled in red ink, was a scribbled line. "When storms come, the herd gathers by the cliffs. They know something. They once saved me from the flood, more than any man ever did." Joanna sat down, her hands trembling as she held the journal. Her voice cracked in the silence. "They saved him once, and then he vanished." Micah asked gently, "You think he died in there?" Joanna nodded slowly. "Or tried to return for the gold. But that time, nature didn't let him go." Echo stood nearby, watching. It stepped forward, lowering its head to nudge aside a small stone near the mine's edge. Beneath it, embedded faintly in the earth, was a hoof-shaped carving, rough, uneven, as if scratched by something hard or sharp. Below the carving was a single line, etched with uneven depth. "We used to trust each other." Joanna stared, unmoving. That couldn't be coincidence. It wasn't a mark for animals. It was meant for people. A message? A warning? Or a promise? They returned to the camp as twilight fell. Joanna spent the evening by the fire, reading every last page of Holloway's journal. His final entries were rushed, slanted, letters bleeding into the margins. "There's something deeper than gold here. These creatures don't just live, they remember. They choose who to trust. And they only show the way, if you're worthy." Wind whispered through the gorge, stirring the flames. Echo stood nearby, silent as a monument to something long buried. Joanna looked up at the stars, thin slivers of moonlight catching on the cliffside petroglyphs, still whispering to anyone patient enough to listen. And in that moment, she understood. She was no longer alone out here. What she thought was past had only been waiting for the right person to carry it forward. Morning in the valley felt as if the world itself had paused to breathe. A pale mist blanketed the wet grass, and sunlight filtered softly through the trees, casting silver across the backs of grazing horses. Joanna sat on a stone near the lake, flipping through Holloway's journal, tracing the markings he had labeled with his own private symbols. Beside her, Micah quietly sketched the petroglyphs with a piece of charcoal in his notebook. The sound of hooves echoed, sharper, more focused than the others. Echo stepped up behind Joanna, head raised toward the valley's western rim. It didn't make a sound. It simply watched. Joanna turned and immediately sensed it, the shift in posture, the alert tension in Echo's stance. Not fear. Vigilance. "Someone's coming," she said flatly. She rose and told Micah to pack up quickly. They had just finished when the hum of engines reached them, distinct and unmistakable. Four-wheelers. Joanna tightened the strap on her backpack. Her eyes darkened. 15 minutes later, 3 figures emerged from the brush at the valley's edge. Leading them was a lean man in a buttoned khaki shirt, carrying a metal equipment case, eyes sharp behind rectangular glasses. Joanna recognized him immediately. Dr. Caleb Irwin, an independent archaeologist she'd once worked with on a dig in Arizona years ago. Behind him walked a woman with blonde hair tied in a tight ponytail, dressed in the green uniform of the State Department of Wildlife, Becky Sloan. She carried a radio, binoculars, and a tranquilizer gun strapped to her thigh. The third was a young technician hauling compact film gear. Joanna stepped forward to meet them. Echo stood close behind her, unmoving. "Hello, Joanna," Caleb called, unable to hide his excitement. "You weren't exaggerating. This place, it's unbelievable." Joanna gave a curt nod before glancing at Becky. "The agency sent you?" Becky didn't smile. "We received a report about Mustangs engaging in close contact with humans. As per BLM protocol, any signs of behavioral compromise must be investigated." Joanna held back a sigh. "They're not compromised. They're choosing. There's a difference. And if you're halfway observant, you'd know that." Caleb stepped in, more diplomatic. "We're just here for preliminary documentation. I brought non-invasive tech." "Joanna, if what you're saying is true, this could be a national heritage site." "It is true, Caleb," she replied. "This is history, and something bigger than that." Becky's eyes narrowed at Echo. "That one's been following you since the first day, hasn't it?" Joanna nodded. "He's the bridge, not a specimen." Becky scoffed and took notes. Caleb signaled the tech to begin scanning near the petroglyph rock wall. Joanna led them to the flat stone bearing the words, "We used to trust each other." Caleb knelt beside the carving, his eyes wide. "Lettering like this doesn't match any known Navajo or Pueblo petroglyph conventions. This is a missing piece of the timeline." As the team worked, Echo moved toward Micah, who gently reached out to stroke its mane. Becky, from across the field, raised her binoculars and observed them. "Who's the kid?" she asked sharply. "Micah Begay. His grandfather's a blacksmith up north. He was searching for his dog when he found this place." Joanna answered. Becky folded her arms. "Unaccompanied minor, no permits, in the vicinity of untagged wild horses and undocumented cultural artifacts." "Do you know that's a federal offense?" Joanna turned, fire in her voice. "If it weren't for that kid in Echo, I wouldn't have found this place. And if you want to start throwing laws around, remember, nature doesn't follow paper rules." Caleb chuckled awkwardly. "Let's keep this civil. We're all here for something extraordinary." As the tech set up scanners, Echo suddenly broke away and moved toward a rocky outcrop by the stream, an area Joanna hadn't yet explored. "He's calling," Micah said. Joanna nodded. "I know." They followed Echo to a shaded grove. There, beneath a moss-covered slab, Echo began nudging the ground. Slowly, layer by layer, a stone basin was revealed, round and ceremonial, etched with symbols of horses, humans, the sun, flowing water, and fire. Joanna gasped. "It's an offering bowl, a sacred rite." Caleb caught up and froze. He reached forward, but Echo stepped between him and the bowl, snorting a low warning. "Don't touch it," Joanna said firmly. "We haven't been granted permission, and that horse isn't giving it." Caleb backed off, hands raised, awestruck. "In all my years, I've never been led to a sacred object by a creature that doesn't speak my language, and yet somehow understands everything." Becky arrived moments later. Her eyes darted between the horse, the basin, and Joanna. The sharpness was gone. In its place, uncertainty. Maybe even fear. "Maybe we don't understand enough," she murmured, then turned away without writing a single note. Joanna placed a hand gently on Echo's head. The Mustang leaned into her, resting its forehead against her shoulder, in a moment that felt less like an embrace and more like a pact. And deep inside her, Joanna knew, the fight to protect the truth was only just beginning. Wind curled through the western cliffs like whispers from an untold past. On a sky streaked with gold and ash, the wild mustangs moved slowly across the outer edge of the wildflower meadow. Joanna stood atop a slope, eyes locked on Echo, friend, guide, and perhaps something more. The Mustang watched a trail of rising dust far in the distance, steadily moving toward the valley. The SUV carrying the film crew had cleared the last stretch of rugged road 2 hours ago. Its windshield still bore crusted stripes of red clay, a testament that this place did not welcome the easy or the uncommitted. Joanna had hesitated before saying yes, but Caleb had convinced her, a small, respectful team, sworn to protect the location's secrecy. They brought not just cameras but reverence. The first to step out were Ryan McNally, a seasoned documentary director who'd filmed bison migrations in Yellowstone; Lena Zhao, a Chinese-American cinematographer known for capturing untouched wildlife with graceful restraint; and Josh Ortega, an audio tech from Montana, who carried his shotgun mic like a priest holds a relic, ready to record nature's truth. Joanna greeted them at the valley's narrow pass, joined by Caleb and Micah. Becky Sloan was absent. After the last visit to the sacred stone, she had formally withdrawn from the project, citing incompatibility with non-traditional field dynamics. Joanna didn't ask questions. "This isn't a site," Joanna told the crew plainly. "It's a living presence. We don't take, we don't frame, we listen, like stepping into a cathedral built without walls." Ryan nodded solemnly. "We're here to tell a story, not own it." As Lena set up her tripod beneath a juniper tree, Echo approached, calm, curious, unafraid. It paused by the camera, inspecting the lens with the quiet knowing of something that had seen the future written in bones and rain. Then, without a sound, it turned and walked deeper into the valley. They followed in silence. The first shots were taken at the lake, where the herd drank beneath the dying light. Lena filmed with breathless stillness, every frame like a painting. Josh knelt near the shoreline, adjusting the gain to capture the sound of hooves entering water. Ryan scribbled notes, silent but lit from within. Then Echo returned. In its mouth, wrapped in damp, worn fabric, was an object. It laid it down gently in front of Joanna, then stepped back. All motion stopped. Joanna knelt, unwrapped the bundle, and found a wooden placard, faded and cracked with time. On its surface, clearly engraved, "Sovereign's Edge, 1894. Joanna's breath caught. That phrase marked the legal boundary between wildlands and settler territory during the first federal land claims in the American West. It wasn't just a boundary, it was a declaration, a line between dominion and reverence. Caleb whispered, voice shaken, "Holloway didn't just find gold. He found a threshold, not just physical, spiritual." Ryan moved closer, eyes glassy. "This isn't a dig, it's a revelation." Joanna cradled the piece of wood, fingers trembling. "This horse brought us proof generations of men searched for and failed to find, not because they lacked tools, but because they weren't invited." As twilight turned gold into shadow, they returned to the sacred stone. The glyphs on the cliffside shimmered under the last light, sunlight catching each etching like it had waited all these years for someone to see it again. Echo stood tall beside them, silent, unwavering. Lena filmed slowly. Through her lens, Echo didn't appear wild. It appeared eternal. Ryan whispered behind the camera, "We don't need narration. The earth is speaking." Caleb stood next to Joanna and placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You kept your promise. You didn't let anyone break the balance." Joanna nodded, gaze still on the glowing stone. "I only did what Echo asked of me." That night, they made camp on the edge of the valley. Firelight danced on their faces, casting long shadows like ancient spirits returning to observe. Micah wrote quietly in his notebook. Shadow, the dog, now fully healed, slept beside Echo as if drawn by an invisible tether of trust. Joanna reopened Holloway's journal. One final passage stood alone. "If someone ever reads this, please don't remove anything from this place. Let it remain as it is. Let it teach. There are things here beyond wealth or glory, creatures who choose to forgive a history we refuse to remember." She closed the book. Above them, stars pierced the black sky. Echo stood still beneath them, not a beast, not a myth, but a monument carved by time and grace. 3 months had passed since the last camera left the valley. But time in this place didn't move like it did elsewhere. It seeped, lingered, and settled into the rock. Here, memory didn't fade. It waited. Joanna Weller sat on her cabin porch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand, watching tendrils of mist drift across the hills. From this spot, she could see the crest of the mesa where Echo had first appeared. Every morning since then, she'd woken early, not from habit, but from something harder to name. Maybe it was hope, maybe it was gratitude, or maybe it was continuation. The federal government had officially designated the area as a protected natural and cultural heritage zone, now named Harmony Ridge. Protecting the Mustangs of the Hidden Valley was no longer the will of one solitary woman. It had become the mission of many, from the National Archaeological Bureau to Wildlife Preservation Services, from university research teams to Navajo cultural groups. Joanna took no grant money. Instead, she reopened her old sculpture workshop, transforming it into a small outpost for scientists and those seeking to understand the unspoken bond between humans and the wild. There were no tours, no visitor passes. Anyone who came had to walk the long path in and be ready to listen. That morning, just as Joanna stood to water the cactus pots on her porch, she heard it. 3 soft knocks. Same rhythm, same spot. On the wood just outside her door. She smiled. "You came back," she whispered, and opened it. Echo stood there in the soft gold of dawn, his coat now clean and bright, white and black streaks shining like a storm cloud lit from within. But this time he wasn't alone. Behind him stood a foal, no more than a few months old, its coat a shimmering gray-silver, like spring grass caught in early dew. Its eyes, clear, curious, watched Joanna without blinking. Echo turned, looked at the foal, then gently tapped the wooden step with his hoof. Joanna sat down slowly, not crossing the threshold. She placed her right hand over her heart and said softly, "Welcome, little one." Echo stepped forward, touching his nose to her hand. The foal followed, awkward but eager, nuzzling beside him. Then Echo lowered his head and revealed something between his teeth. Joanna reached up and took it. It was a smooth river stone, round and polished like it had been shaped by centuries of water. On its surface, barely visible, was a carved marking, 2 horseshoes touching. She held the stone carefully. "It's not a gift," she said quietly. "It's a conversation." In the weeks that followed, Echo returned often, each time with something new. A fossilized bone, a spiraled piece of bark, a rare alpine flower. Every item held a story, but Echo never told it. He let Joanna learn it. Micah had moved back to live with his grandfather near the ridge. He spent most of his time helping research teams track the Mustangs. Shadow, the dog, had become Echo's shadow too, often found dozing in his shade come sunset. Caleb Irwin now taught at a local university, founding a new program focused on symbolic interaction between wild horses and indigenous human history. He spent much of his time at Harmony Ridge, not as a scientist, but as a steward. Ryan, Lena, and Josh, after their documentary The Horse That Knocked premiered at 3 major festivals, refused all commercial offers. They simply said, "This story isn't ours to sell. It's one we're lucky to live." And Joanna, the woman who once vanished after tragedy, was now the living witness to something neither science nor poetry could fully describe. Every morning, before the mesa caught first light, the knock would come. Echo, the wild horse, still returned. And each time he brought not a token, but a choice. A whisper of trust from a world humanity had long abandoned. Once, a group of biology students asked Joanna, "Do you think Echo understands what you're saying?" She didn't answer right away. She looked toward the sunlit ridge where Echo and the foal had just disappeared into sagebrush. Then she said slowly, "It's not about him understanding me. It's about me learning how to understand him, and learning to become someone worth his trust." She paused, then smiled. It all started with an apple, and a wild soul that knew how to knock. If you believe that a wild creature can carry the secrets of an entire civilization, drop a 1 below. If you've ever witnessed a moment that defied explanation, yet touched the deepest part of your heart, comment 0. And if Joanna and Echo's journey made you believe that trust can go beyond language, hit subscribe so you won't miss the stories to come, where freedom, love, and life are told through the eyes of souls that can never be tamed.